Welcome back to the Changemaker podcast. I'm your host, Deke Copenhaver. My guest today is my good friend and just spiritual counselor in some ways, Will Dyer. Will is the senior pastor at the First Baptist Church in Augusta, Georgia. In his role at First Baptist, Will is responsible for preaching, teaching, and casting vision for the future of the 2,000-member church. In 2019, Will was selected as one of the top 10 leaders under 35 in the Metro Augusta area, and he has been a featured speaker at multiple preaching conferences in the Southeast. Will is a graduate of the University of Georgia, the Candler School of Theology at Emory University, and the McAfee School of Theology at Mercer University. After working in a variety of church settings over the past 14 years, he still believes that the church is the collection of people through whom God wants to change the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Will Dyer.
Welcome to the Changemaker podcast, hosted by Deke Copenhaver. Deke is the author of The Changemaker, a Forbes publishing book that has reached #1 on Amazon on multiple occasions and in multiple categories like management skills and total quality management. During this podcast, Deke interviews exceptional change-making leaders. Deke currently operates Copenhaver Consulting, where he helps local governments and other public organizations maximize their potential. He's also a sought-after public speaker. We hope that the Changemaker has an impact on you today and that you find takeaways that make you a better leader in your life. Now, here's Deke.
Thank you, my friend. It is good to be here.
I was thinking about it, I need to see about the production of, like, if we can get canned audience applause when I say that.
Yes.
I think that would be good.
Yeah, that's great. That's what everybody needs, is just a little more head exploding.
Yes, I think that would be good. But I want to dive into this, that you went to the University of Georgia, as did I.
That's right.
Go Dogs.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't qualify you to be a politician if you went to the
fact.
University of Georgia. But you majored in political science, which I majored in, and religion. So you had a double major. But for those of we've got listeners all over the globe. For those of you who don't know, basically in the South, it's deemed not polite to talk about political science and religion.
Yep.
So you majored in the two topics that polite Southerners are not supposed to discuss publicly.
Mm-hmm.
How'd that happen?
So I went to the University of Georgia thinking I would go to law school.
Uh-huh.
And so start taking political science classes. I meet with a pre-law advisor, and he essentially said, listen, you are going to learn everything about the law that you need to learn in law school. So right now, get a degree in something that's going to expand your mind, that's going to teach you to think critically. And the University of Georgia has a religion department. And I did not grow up in the church, didn't grow up as a Christian. I didn't become a follower of Jesus till I was 20. But I've always been fascinated with religion. And so I signed up for a religion course, a New Testament teaching of Jesus class that was taught by a PhD from Harvard. Beth LaRocca Pitts was her name. And I will never forget sitting in her class and hearing her talk about Jesus and thinking, oh my word, I've never heard anything like this. If this is not what I heard in the church when I was a kid, and walking out and going, okay, you can follow Jesus not just with your heart, but with your mind.
Yeah.
And I was transfixed by it. And so at that point I went, all right, I'm going to get both of these degrees, and fell in love with both. And I still love both. And the fact of the matter is, nothing is more important to me than politics and religion, because the polis, or the ecclesia, right? The gather, that's a word for the church in ancient Greece. That was actually the collection, the assembly that met to talk about the political matters that happened. And so there was an intentional move by the early church to use political language when talking about who they were. These things are connected to each other.
Yeah, they absolutely are. Well, I would say when I was in office that, being mayor is what I do, but my faith is who I am. But I want to ask you this, because you've majored in religion at the University of Georgia, and I've got a few years on you. I took a religion class at Georgia, and it was one of my favorite classes that I ever took. But the professor was a guy named Dr. Will Power.
Oh, my.
And so
he was
Will
still
Power.
there, dude.
Really?
Yeah, he was still there.
Compared everything in life to bass fishing.
Uh-huh. Will Power was a professor of theology.
Yeah.
And what I loved about UGA was because, it's a liberal arts university, right? It's not a seminary, which is teaching you to go work in the church. It is a school that is not going to say, this is what you need to believe. They're going to say, here's the broad strand of thought throughout the whole of Christian history. We're going to teach you all of it, and then you get to decide where are you at on the spectrum. And my experience at Candler, where I went to seminary, was much the same. But the benefit and what Will Power brought to the table was you're going to walk out of his classroom not only with a better understanding of why you believe what you believe, but you're also going to understand why other people are where they are. And so we can now have a civil conversation, which, going back to politics, is what we're missing.
Yeah. And what is so desperately needed right now, and I think we can get there. You know, you and I have become good friends, and I think we're very like-minded in a lot of ways. We probably don't agree on everything. But let me ask you about this, because effectively politics gets into everything, every organization. So you're pastor of a church of 2,000 people.
Right.
So to be in a leadership position like that, because not everything you do, everybody's going to agree with.
That's fact.
You know, so what is that like to navigate that? But you obviously do a very good job of it.
Sure. So the baseline for me, when I look at leading the church, the baseline for me goes back to a saying from this old guy in the church. His name's St. Augustine, writing 400s-ish, the Roman Empire's collapsing, and he's one of the leaders of the early church. And he has this saying that is really remarkable, where he said, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, but in all things, charity.
Yeah.
And he doesn't mean the giving out of things, but charitas in the Latin sense of it, which is a generosity of spirit.
Yeah.
And so for me, leading the church, we're not all going to agree on everything. So what are the essentials in leading the church? And for us, it is, hey, Paul, for example, he said, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, welcome to the family.
Yeah.
That's the essential. So we can disagree on political identity. We can disagree on economic theory. We can disagree on any number of things because we have the essential.
Yep.
And as long as we can agree on the essential, hey, everything else is fair game.
Well, you and I had a drink last week, which I always enjoy getting together in a relaxed setting. But you said, I said, well, is there anything topic that you want me to steer away from because it might, you know, upset your congregation? And you said something to me that I've shared with so many other people. You said that my congregation and I have come to an understanding of the fact that they might not always agree with me. I sometimes make them think, but they know I'm not going to embarrass Jesus.
Yeah.
And I'm like, that's just so grounded. I loved hearing that.
Yeah, that's the goal, is that if we can represent Jesus well, then we can agree to disagree on everything else. One of my favorite things that I used to do at my previous church is I would go to a bar and I would sit on a stage, and it was a night that the owner of the bar let me do. We called it Ask Anything, and patrons could come into the bar, and we packed the place out every time. And they would come in, they would fill out questions, put them in the bucket, and then Albert, the owner of the bar, would come and just dump the bucket on a little table that I had, and I would answer any question people had about life, about faith, about politics. And what I came to find is the answer that people appreciated most, and the answer that religious people never want to give, is really pretty simple. I don't know.
Yeah.
And so that's when I have conversations about any variety of things, the willingness to be humble, the willingness to be transparent, the willingness to say, I don't know, which ultimately you're representing Jesus well when you do those things, gives us the freedom and the trust to have great conversation.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you talk about doing that in a bar.
Yeah.
And that's what I've told people, that I think I keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in America through my travels and speaking to your average man or woman on the street. And usually that's in a bar or a restaurant. Yeah. Because people are relaxed. You're going where they are. But I was invited while I was still in office to speak at an event called Theology on Tap.
Incredible.
And so it was a bunch of 20 and 30-something years olds at the Knights of Columbus facility. And so I'm sitting there drinking wine, doing exactly what you said. And I told him, I said, I'm probably killing any political career that I may have wanted to have, because sitting here drinking wine while you're filming me, you know, this is a campaign ad waiting to happen if I ever wanted to run for anything else. But I do think that it's really, to connect with people, to have those conversations, you have to have humility, and you have to be comfortable going where they are.
Yep. That is the goal That's the goal of the church moving forward, right? For so long, institutional religion has said, you come where we are.
Yeah.
And we've built fortresses, right? But the beautiful thing is that the gospel says, let's build bridges, let's not build walls. And so part of the role of the church, right, as Christian culture is dying a slow death. I mean, it's long gone in Western Europe, but in America, it's dying a slow death. And what I say is good riddance to that, because now it gives the church an opportunity to actually be the church.
Yeah.
As cultural Christianity goes away, now we have an opportunity to re-engage with our city, to re-engage in conversations where people are, rather than saying, meet us on our turf. It's saying, hey, we care about you. We want to be where you are, man.
Well, and that's the thing. It's interesting in a church that I used to go to. So I became a deacon, but the minister that trained me said that one of the biggest controversial issues that he had to deal with regularly was in the Presbyterian church. There's a red hymnal and there's a blue hymnal.
Oh God!
And the red hymnal is perceived as the traditional hymnal, whereas the blue hymnal is perceived as the new hymnal. New hymns. But 70% of the hymns in the blue are in the red.
Yeah.
But people would go ballistic when they'd have to sing from the blue hymnal.
Dude, that's
and he
hilarious.
said that's just, people just, every time I call people to sing from the blue hymnal, I just get raked over the coals. And I'm like, aren't there bigger picture issues to deal with?
Yeah, I would say so. That's hilarious.
But it's funny, and that's what I used to tell people too, is I'm like, well, even Amazing Grace was new at one point. But it's like, and I draw another correlation between politics and religion. If you're not getting the younger generation involved, and you've got a contemporary service that's really growing, it's, the church is going to die. But in the same thing in politics, I understand why so many young people don't want anything to do with politics, and a lot of them don't want anything to do with the church because they perceive it as inauthentic.
Right. If we can, to talk theologically for a second, right? One of the separating markers of the Christian faith is this idea that God took on flesh in Jesus, the incarnation. So God loved us enough to identify with who we are. And part of the role of the church is to go and do the same, to identify with people in the moments and the spaces and places in life where they find themselves.
Yeah.
Right? It is to be authentic, to take the Jesus, for example, says, don't be like the hypocrites. It's a Greek word that literally refers to an actor in a Greek play. The word hypocrite in its original context, it's an actor. And so the church for so long has said, hey, come in this space, put on your mask and play a certain part, be this role.
Yeah.
But the goal of faith is to say you can be your authentic and true self, the person God created you to be, but it requires us to meet you where you are and have a real and deep conversation.
What's often concerning to me, we do have the separation of church and state, but one of the things that I always said that if I was never going to use my faith to profit myself politically. And so often, you see politicians and they're shooting commercials coming out of a church and everything. That sometimes neither political party is the party of Christianity or any other faith.
Right.
So it's concerning to me when it's basically saying, well, unless you're in this political party, you can't be a Christian.
We got at the church, I got a letter the other day, a flyer from a political advocacy group. And what it was a voter guide for November. And it gave you the candidates and said, here's where each person stands on each issue. And it basically, and then it said, you cannot tell people who to vote for, but it told you who to vote for. And that's a real problem because what we have done, and it used to be an exclusive trait of the right, but now it is also on the left as well, where what we've done is we've tried to say Jesus is on our team.
Yeah.
Right. If you really love Jesus, you're going to support the social safety net because Jesus in Matthew 25 talks a lot about the social safety. It talks about, when you care for the least of these, you're caring for me. That's right. That's true. That's good. And on the right side, we talk about issues that Jesus would deeply care about. And I'm not going to go into them, but yes, there are moments in our political life where Jesus would identify with one side or the other. But I constantly remind our people that Jesus is not a Republican. Jesus is not a Democrat. Jesus is God.
Yeah.
And he's above our politics. And the biggest thing for me, going back again to Paul, one of the early Christians, he said that in Christ Jesus, there's neither male nor female, slave nor free, Greek nor Jew, and if we can translate to the 21st century, Republican or Democrat, but all are one in Christ Jesus. So your political identity matters, but only to a certain point.
Yeah.
And once it becomes your primary identification, we end up picketing outside of FBI offices.
Yeah.
And getting in real dangerous spaces.
And that's concerning to me, is that what I think we've seen to some degree is political parties have become people's religion.
100%.
And they put, the needs of the party or the wants of the party or staying in power above their own doing what they know is right, based on their faith.
Mm-hmm. So this is what the book I was talking about before we got started. Jonathan Sacks.
Get into that, brother. Get into that.
Jonathan Sacks wrote a book in 2020 called Morality, and it's Finding the Good in Divided Times. And Sacks was the chief rabbi of Great Britain for a number of years. He died cancer a few years back, but the last book he wrote was an appeal to the middle ground.
Yep.
Because part of what he said, and this is fascinating, the book is worth reading. It is a transformative book. But what he said in one of the first chapters is that Western culture, liberal democracies traditionally have been founded on three pillars. There's an economic pillar, so the accumulation and the distribution of wealth. Then there's the political pillar, which is the taking of power and how do we distribute it, and the legitimization of power.
Yeah.
How do we ensure that we trust our government? And then the third is a moral pillar. And that's traditionally been filled by faith, right?
Yeah.
And it is instilling in us the virtues of charity, of temperance, of humility, of goodwill, right? Faith, hope, love, etc. And those three things together are the basis for a society that can flourish. And what is really interesting, and I won't go too deep into the book, but essentially what Sacks says is that beginning in about 1962, we begin to see a transformation where we go from a culture of we to a culture of I.
Yep.
And the individual begins to take precedent. And the most important thing is how I feel, how I think, what I want.
Mm-hmm.
And it becomes no longer a question of what I ought to do, but what I want to do. And we begin to see a breakdown of the moral dimension of our culture. And so what we would traditionally use as shaping our people, we now have boiled down to economic decisions, right? How can I get the most money?
Yeah.
Or political decisions. How can I get the most power? But that's not the primary question. And as we see the breaking down of morals in our culture, the impact is that we are left with simply politics and economics. And those two things on their own cannot sustain a culture.
Well, it's I'm happily independent, but I told people that my political views are not really political views, but it goes back to what you said. I'm like, I think that people that are able-bodied should work, mm-hmm. and I think people that can't take care of themselves, we should help take care of as a government. I'm like, it's just pretty simple to me, and that's guided by my faith. That's not guided by any political rhetoric.
It's the basis of a just civilization. So, go all the way back to the founding of Israel, right? When you read in Deuteronomy and Leviticus where, hey, look, when you're in the promised land and you are taking the fruit of your field, right, and the fruit of your labor, and you're going out and you're reaping your crops, leave 10%. Leave 10% behind for those people that can't get stuff on their own, so they can come in and they can have food to eat and they can have sustenance for their life, because it's not about the accumulation for yourself, but it's about the goodness of the group.
Absolutely. And that's the thing to me, is that I've dedicated basically my adult life to bringing people together on common ground and using every platform I can to do that. So this podcast organically is now getting 4,000 listens per episode. And we're about to start marketing it, but I'm like, that's what I think people are hungry for. And they don't want to be made to feel afraid, which is basically what politicians do. But it's interesting to me, I want to get your take on this, because I'm hoping to have Andrew Yang, who ran for president and mayor of New York City, on the show shortly, hopefully. Awesome. But it was announced that he and a group of Republican higher-ups that had worked in the White House formed a new political party, mm-hmm. called the Forward Party for moderates. which I'm like, bam, I'm all there for that. But the extremes of either party slammed it, tremendously. And I think that goes back to power. Democrats and Republicans don't want a viable third party because it undermines their power and control.
Yeah. So drawing a parallel example in church life, for example, in the I'm not a Presbyterian, but I've got some Presbyterian friends, and there are two branches of the Presbyterian church. There's the PCA, which tends to be more conservative, and the PCUSA, which tends to be more liberal, progressive, depending on what terminology you want to use. But there's a new group that's emerged over the past few years called ECO. And ECO has said, hey, look, we're neither of what are two increasingly extreme options. And instead, we're finding a center ground where we want to hold to the best of what is the orthodox position of 2,000 years of Christian history, but also giving credence to what is the heart of Jesus' message, to love the Lord, to love God, and to love your neighbor as yourself.
Yep.
And so they've started this new thing, and it's thriving. And the result of that is an enrichment for everybody.
Yep.
So I look at the political dimension of our culture and go, there's nothing wrong with a third option because the majority of us don't live on the polls.
No. And I've often made the point, I'm like, I'm not going to begrudge anybody their own political views. And, I'm not going to hate anybody because they have a D or an R in front of their name. But to me, I just want to unite the tribes, bring everybody together on common ground. If you're angry and mad all the time and you're just negative and you want to tear things down, that's fine. But what I'm doing might not be the place for you. But I think the majority of people want to get along, and they believe in the power of community.
And I imagine if you were to do the demographic dive on who's listening to your podcast, it's going to be people in that 30 to 40 range, maybe 25 to 40 range that are increasingly tired of the polarization.
Yep.
That are saying, hey, we want to sit at the table and we want to have conversations, because if you do that, you're not going to emerge agreeing on everything.
No.
But it's hard to hate somebody when you share a drink with them. It's hard to hate somebody when you share a meal with them.
Yep.
That's the goal, right?
Well, and I've mentioned to you, I just became a founding partner of a national nonprofit organization called Starts With Us, and I've got their CEO coming on, Tom Fishman. But that's the goal, is it starts with us. I think it's personal accountability. But if we can all take the pledge to treat each other with curiosity, compassion, and courage to have the difficult conversations without it skewing off the rails,
right.
How much, if we all accept that personal accountability to do that, how much better can things get? But I have shared with the founders, I said, I think this movement's going to gain steam in a real hurry, because here again, you've got so many people that a friend of mine in Vancouver, Dov Barron, says, I think people in the United States are not as polarized as people think. Most people that I know feel they're politically homeless. Yep. They're like, I'm a Democrat, but the cancel culture is ridiculous. Or I'm a Republican, but the far right is just off the chain now. Yeah. And so I do believe that's what most people, and I think you probably see that in your own congregation.
Oh my goodness. Listen, I've striven over the past 6 years to create an environment where we're a big tent.
Yep.
Right. Where we are. And so what's been beautiful is to see a lessening of the poles and the extremes within the church. Right. I'll never forget when I first got there. It's 2017 April. And so we're coming off one of the most contentious elections in American history. Yeah. And I go in for a Wednesday night dinner, and I walk in the door and I see a guy wearing a great big red MAGA hat.
Yeah.
On a Wednesday night dinner. And so I walked up to the guy and I very kindly but seriously said, hey, you need to take that hat off. And he said, excuse me? And I said, no, in this space, that's not the most important thing. And by you wearing that hat, because he was wearing it intentionally, it's creating an alienation, it's creating a division. And I go, we can have those conversations. But here in this space, our primary identity is something bigger.
Yep.
And so let's focus on those things. What I love about Jesus is that when you read the stories of his life, he spends time, and this is the best part, he spends time with everyone.
Yep.
He spends time with the Pharisees, the religious leaders. He spends time with the tax collectors who are despised by good Jews of the first century. He spends time with prostitutes. He spends time with every single person you could imagine.
Yeah.
Now, he doesn't always say, I'm spending time with you, therefore I agree with everything that you are doing. No. But what he says is, I recognize the humanity, that you're created in the divine image and you are worthy of my time. And I want to hear where you're at.
Yeah.
Great starting point.
Well, and that's the thing to me is I've often said that, if Jesus were around today, he'd be, oh, that guy's a hippie. He's a rebel. He's hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and everything. But that's to me, I worry in society about people putting themselves in silos.
Yeah.
And whether it's in very affluent communities where you're only around people that have tons and tons of money and you never interact with anybody beneath your social strata, I think that's a concern to me, that where is that going to lead someday? Because I've shared with you before coming on air that my sister and I have had discussions that it used to be you have the haves and the have-nots, and now you have the haves, the have-nots, and the have-more.
Yeah.
But I don't think that that's a good thing. That's probably feeding the polarization to as much as it exists, just people that never interact.
Yeah. So going back to, and this was, I quoted these stats to you a few minutes before we started, where it's in Jonathan Sachs' book, where the average CEO pay to worker pay in the United States in 1960 was 20-1. But in 2020, it was 351-1. The average, so the polarization between the haves and the have-nots, it is increasingly widening. I'll never forget. So my church, if for your listeners that aren't familiar with it, it's a big church on a hill. It's an affluent church, and so I spend a lot of my time around people that are like me.
Yeah.
And I will never forget. My wife's a dentist, and I came home one day and I was telling her about what I had been doing that day, and she stopped and she said, "Will, have you ever thought about the fact that I'm a dentist and I spend more time with poor people than you do?"
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? And so I have since made and this was years ago, this was right at the beginning of my time, but there was someone in my life that was willing to hold me accountable for who I was becoming as a person. And I was able to course correct and adjust as a result of it, right? So the silo mentality is possible as long as we surround ourselves with only people like us.
Yep.
But if we're willing to take a look in the mirror and go, when's the last time I had dinner with someone of a different economic level? Yep. When's the last time I had coffee with someone of a different sexual orientation? Yep. When's the last time I sat down with someone of a different political opinion? And if the answer is I can't remember, then we're in dangerous territory.
Yeah. And that's with what I do with the podcast, with what I've done with my book, with what I did in office, I have a genuine curiosity about people. But as you say, if you sit down and discuss, everybody's got something to bring to the table. I honestly believe. But we've gotten to be good friends with, we've got a corgi that's got lymphoma, so we're having to go to Columbia, South Carolina, about an hour and away to a specialist regularly. Well, we made friends with some homeless guys up there. And so many people say, well, homeless people are homeless because they want to be. And so I've talked to my friends up there. They don't want to be homeless.
Right.
They've fallen on hard times. There's some mental illness there, but it's just so easy to try to put everybody in a box.
Right.
And I'm like, but when I hear people say now, well, homeless people want to be homeless, I'm like, how many homeless people do you know?
Right.
Because I've got some good friends who happen to be homeless, and I can guarantee you straight from the horse's mouth, they don't want to be homeless.
Right. Right. That's right. And it's an easy answer to say, oh, they want to be homeless, right? Because this is the propensity of all of us, is to construct the world as black and white.
Yeah.
But the reality is, in faith, in politics, and everything in between, there's a whole lot of gray.
Yeah.
But living in the gray area requires us to do some soul searching.
Yeah.
It requires us to think deeply about things. And we, in a world that is increasingly tied to social media,
yeah,
in a world that is living off 140 character tweets,
yeah,
they're homeless because they want to be, rather than maybe there are systems in place that perpetuate the cycle.
yeah.
And what can we do? Because it's hard work to look at what is currently existing in our culture and go, how can we shift things so that everyone has a more equitable chance to succeed?
And I like to make my decisions based on accurate information. So I'll give you an example. I met with Christ Community Healthcare last week. So that's
Great
for our listeners. It's a Christian-centered nonprofit who deals with providing health care to the lower income. So I shared with them that the last time I was there was my last year in office. And I asked them, what are the primary zip codes that you're seeing people from? And they named 3 zip codes. And I said, we had the Georgia Charter School Association here a number of years ago. So they said, if you're going to focus on deploying a charter school model, these are the 3 zip codes that you need to focus on.
Okay.
Same zip codes. And what most people didn't know at that time, those 3 zip codes were in the top 10 in the state of Georgia for putting people into the prison system. And I'm like, okay, if we don't address educational and healthcare outcomes in these zip codes, that's never going to change. That's not political. That's just fact. Right. I mean, you can look at it.
Right. That is quantifiable data. I mean, this is where I got to meet with some folks from Heritage Academy here in Augusta to see the work that they are doing.
Yeah.
In what is an overlooked and neglected area of our city. It's just remarkable. Yep. And they're doing it because Jesus teaches them to, which is supposed to be the goal of the church. So good.
Well, I remember I had a minister that when the Great Recession hit, he said, if you're an angry and just negative Christian, because a lot of people were, that was a difficult time. He said, don't tell anybody you're a Christian.
Yeah, and do us a favor. Do us a favor. Don't do that. Listen, I mean, the world is filled with so much cynicism and negativity right now. I mean, if you thought it was bad in the recession in 2008, I mean, look at now.
Oh, my gosh.
And what I always remind people of is that Jesus was always willing to take a realistic look at what was going on, right? So if you go to the Sermon on the Mount, he would say, you've heard that it was said. And then he would mention a cultural situation, and he would break it down. But he never ended with deconstruction, because deconstruction is easy. To say what's wrong with something, that's not hard.
Yep.
But then he would shift and go, but now I say unto you. And he would build something better in its place, right? The cynicism of our age is easy.
Yep.
But to create something more beautiful, to show a more positive way forward, now that's the Jesus work. And that is why I love what you were doing, sir.
Well, I appreciate that. And I tell people, I am a Christian. I begrudge nobody their own faith tradition, but I am not perfect. I'm a sinner like everybody else. But I do know, and sometimes I doubt myself, but I do not doubt the calling that the Lord has placed on my life. And it's to use all of these unique situations, and I enjoy it. It is fulfilling to me to have these conversations, and hopefully to our listeners. I'm trying to show that as we've discussed, in the mainstream media and politics and social media, all you see are the extremes. But I'm trying to reflect that there are people like yourself doing great things, focusing on bringing people together. I've got a musician coming on shortly and talking to him about music brings people together. Sports brings people together. Your church services do as well. But I think people, if they feel a part of a community, it just feels better.
Right. And let me say this, because recently there's been a lot of rhetoric. There's a representative out of Colorado who said some things about, we're a Christian nation and the church should be running the country. And that's where, for me, I mean, I talk a lot about Jesus. I do. But the fact of the matter is, our culture is a rich tapestry of diverse belief systems.
Yep.
And I have friends, some of my good friends are Muslims and Jews, and we are made better when we find ourselves in deep and meaningful conversation with each other, right? So this is where I think it's important to recognize that one of the beautiful things about our country is that we can have conversations with people and we can recognize deep-seated beliefs that are different from each other. So I can say to my Jewish friends and my Muslim friends, we don't agree on everything.
Yeah.
We have true different opinions about the nature of God, for example. But that doesn't mean we can't be friends.
Yep.
That doesn't mean we can't collaborate together on making the city a better place for all of its residents. And when we find the common ground to work together on things, everyone is made better. And so when you talk about working together, the church at its best is willing to work together with everyone.
Yep.
And you don't see enough of that in media, in social media, and the best Christian voices are ones who are not fighting for exclusion, but they're fighting for inclusion.
Yeah. Well, and that's, we serve a uniting God. I just feel that way. And I've often said, people would ask me, when I had a radio show, somebody said, well, if Augusta was a food, what would it be? And I said it'd be a gumbo, because everybody knows that gumbo would not taste as good with just one ingredient. And so we've often been portrayed as, a racially divided city. I focused for 9 years on healing the racial divide. But I share with people that here in Augusta, we host every fall an event called Arts in the Heart of Augusta. Mm-hmm. So it brings 90,000 people to our urban core. It celebrates diversity and just different ethnicities and different just countries and everything, different cultures. And we've never had an incident at that event. Yeah. And it pumps like $4 million into the local economy. And so when people would say our community is divided, I'm like, that's what Augusta looks like to me.
That's right.
It looks like Arts in the Heart, where people from diverse backgrounds and just can come together just to celebrate arts and culture and diversity in our city center.
Dude, I walk my little girls to school every day at Lake Forest Hills, which is a public school in Augusta. And 9-year-old, 6-year-old, 4-year-old, and we drop them off at school, and I watch as these kids go in the front door. And there are black kids, and there are Indian kids, there are Hispanic kids, there are white kids, and it is a true diversity of people coming together for something that is rich and good.
Yep.
And I love that gumbo illustration. And I'm going to use that in a sermon one day.
Use that
soon,
in a
sir.
sermon. No pride of authorship. But it does, to me, I think we are not as much of a world divided as we are a world yearning to come together.
That's right.
And it's just, but it's funny, when I first wrote my book, I had a young reporter that was 20-something years old, and she said, well, don't you think appealing to the middle ground is kind of lukewarm? I said, no, I happen to think bringing people together on common ground is pretty cool. But what I realized is, being 20-something years old, the political polarization, that's all she's ever known.
Yeah.
So, but I think if you provide people with an alternative to the status quo, they will go to it. And I know for First Baptist to call a young minister who can go have a drink every now and again with the former mayor, who also loves rock and roll, that's a common ground thing for us.
Yes, sir.
That's a great sign to me.
Yeah. Going again back to that Jonathan Sacks book, he says when we hang out with people not like us, we realize that they're people like us.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's the goal, is to see the beauty in all different folks.
Yeah.
And so, and that's, music is something that can unite us way more than we ever imagined.
Yep.
Deke. This is maybe another topic for another day. But yes, that was one of the first things we connected over.
Oh yeah. Well, it's interesting. I had Bob Crawford, the Avett Brothers bassist, as a guest, and we talked about that. And I said, man, when you guys are up there and you're connecting with an audience, it's not like, I'm sure there are Democrats, there are Republicans, there are people from all different walks of life. They're not there to discuss politics. They're there to hear you guys. And that's a communal spirit. Man,
the Avett Brothers music is some of the richest theological themes in all of me. There's this one, and it goes back to one of their earliest albums, where he says, the lead singer says, I want to have pride like my mama had, but not like the kind in the Bible that turns you bad.
Yeah.
There's a pride in who we are. There's a pride in being a part of a family. There's a pride, like you have, in being a part of a city that makes us all better.
Yep.
Right? And these guys, oh my word, I listen to their music. I cry easily, but their stuff, dude, I will break down in tears on the reg listening to the Avett Brothers.
Oh, well, I'll tell you one last story, and then we'll start to wrap it up. But I was able to share with Bob that, unfortunately, a year ago this past July, Deke Boardman, who was a cousin of my wife and just a local legend, but he had been dealing with illnesses, dealing with pain and everything, and he happened to take his own life. So Virginia Bundy, formerly Clausen, and her husband, I'm not sure if they were married at the time, but they went to see the Avett Brothers in Red Rocks. And so when the song No Hard Feelings came on, it touched them so much and helped them with the healing process. And they sent videos. They're just both bawling, crying. I'm like, Bob, I want you to know that that song helped to heal two people or a family that I'm extremely close to. So I just want to say thank you.
When I lay down my fears, my hopes, and my doubts, the rings on my fingers and the keys to my house.
Yep.
There's no hard feelings. I mean, come on, dude. Those lyrics speak to the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, my word.
Well, I'll need to get Bob back on. But
Yes, you do.
But I will tell you, we could talk literally for hours.
100%.
And we do talk for hours.
Yeah.
But I think you will be a frequent guest. But I just think that this has been so educational for my listeners, because a lot of people, it's easy to condemn religion because they're all, I mean, painting with a broad brush. Everybody's judging me and everything. And so I think you've just hopefully opened a lot of people's eyes and maybe not converted them, but maybe given them a little different perspective about our religion.
Yeah. The great Rabbi Abraham Heschel said, I never once asked God for success. I asked God for wonder, and he gave it to me.
Yep.
And for me, I find wonder and joy and goodness in the way of Jesus.
Yep.
And I believe that's what it is, that's what religion is, at its best is intended to be.
Yeah.
Is to show us just how good this gift is.
Yep.
So.
Well, as we close it out, I always like to ask my guests this. On a daily basis, what puts a smile on your face and brings joy to your heart?
My 4-year-old daughter, on a daily basis right now, she wakes up at 6:15, between 6 and 6:30, and she stands at the top of the stairs, and as loud as she can, she starts her day with, "This girl is on fire." And it's like, man, if we could all have that kind of confidence and that kind of, I'm starting my day and I'm on fire.
Yep.
This is every day right now, Deke, and it's incredible. So that's what's putting a smile on my face.
I got to find a song to sing to start every day now.
Yeah, that's right.
Figure that out. But, man, Will, you have been an awesome guest. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here.
I'm honored to be a part of the podcast, and even more so to be your friend.
Absolutely. Well, that's me too. That's all we got. Dropping the mic, and we are out.